So there's an interaction I've had many times with, let's say, veteran photographers. You know, photographers that work professionally in the days of film. And that interaction usually goes like this. I'm walking around, I'm shooting with a film camera or I'm shooting film. Why would you shoot film? Digital is so much easier, it's so much better. It's such a pain in the butt to shoot film. And I get where they're coming from. It's because they worked as a photographer in a time where photography was inconvenient. It was a tough process. It was a lot of work. There was a lot more risk involved because there was a lot of steps to get you from the camera to the final image. So watching a bunch of younger people shoot film in the modern day is befuddling, I think, to a lot of photographers who really struggled with the film medium day to day. And I think I'm crossing over into a line where I'm starting to understand the mindset of these photographers. The mindsets of seeing young people do things that are totally inexplicable to me. But I think the thing that's causing me to feel that way are DIGICAMs. Now, this camera is an Olympus FE360, and this camera also happens to be my first camera. This is the camera that started it all for me. This is the very camera, oh, battery's dead. This is the very camera that I walked around in my small town in Hawaii taking pictures of paradise. There was an endless amount of things to take photos of, and I got this for my birthday in 2009, and it took over my life forever. I had no idea that that would happen. 8 megapixels, it's fine. At the time, it was magical. It took very good shots. But now I look back at those shots and they have not aged very well. And as I moved on to different, better gear, I kind of forgot about this camera and cameras like it. And I just kind of thought, you know, at the end of the day, iPhones replace these. Until I realized that they're growing in popularity again. But I've had no interest in DIGICAMs. I've had no interest in going back to that point and shoot era. I keep that Olympus to put on my shelf. Looks nice, but I just have no interest in going back to DIGICAMs. At least I didn't until now. Recently, I scored one of these, the Canon Powershot SD1000. Digital elf. What would get me to get this camera? And I actually knew nothing about this camera. I remember digital elves when they came out, but a couple months ago I was shooting photos with friends, and Matt Lewis, who I keep name dropping on this channel, had this camera. And I hadn't even seen the photos from it, but I just thought it just looked beautiful. I mean, it's such a beautiful camera, the like harsh corners and everything. It looks so cool to me. I love it. I love how beautiful it is. And there was this era of Canon cameras that just like looked like jewelry, looked like pieces of art. There's a video camera that looks really cool that I think is in a similar style. And so I was attracted to the look of this camera. And then I saw the images that he was shooting with it. You know, after seeing him with this camera, I broke into his house and robbed him. No, I'm just kidding. I traded him some Fuji lenses and scored this. And so the photos I got with this camera turned out really cool. There's a lot of green on Kiowa Island, and that's when this camera works best. It likes green. And a lot of these photos surprised me because they had this baked in look of kind of a pharmacy level 35mm film, a film that already has a baked in look. It wasn't flat like Portra or something. It was like Ultramax or Cinestill 400D sometimes. It has its own look. And due to the low resolution of the camera, it had a little bit of a grain to it. That said, I'm still not fully on the DIGICAM train. And I love this camera, and I love how portable it is. I love how it looks. It's almost more of an accessory, if anything. Just having this in my pocket at all times, like, just looks cool as an everyday carry. And I would say half or 3/4 of the images I shoot with it I really like. But that 25%, that 50% of the time, it reminds me of what it really is. It is a fossil from maybe the worst visual era in human history. The early 2000s were the ugliest time to be alive. And I know, I was there, I lived it. Everything looked bad. It's funny that we're crossing into this early 2000s aesthetic is coming back, and I find that funny. You know, it makes sense. That's just how fashion and trends work, but the early 2000s is not a good looking time at all. It was a time where film was transitioning into digital, so we had all these new fun tools, and we overcorrected. You know, filmmakers would make a movie, they'd make a crime thriller about a hacker, except for some reason, the movie would be green. Just because we could. That's why we did things. Digital allowed us to do things we couldn't before, and so everybody was just going buck wild, trying awful looking things. HDR photography is a great example. There was this era of photography where everyone decided to layer about 70 images on top of each other so you could get every piece of shadow and highlight exposed, and it would create these super detailed shots of like an old car or a landscape, and they don't hold up. I'll have you remember the Star Wars prequels also came out in the early 2000s, and they look worse than the movies that came out in the 70s and 80s. Recently, I went to a funeral for a family member, and on the table in the greeting area were all of the family photos from the past few decades. And the ones that looked incredible were the film photos and the Polaroids. They all just still looked like they could have maybe been shot yesterday, aside from maybe some fade in the print. But the photos that looked the worst, the ones that didn't age well, were the ones from the early 2000s that were shot on a Sony Cybershot or something that everyone used to carry around before they had a smartphone. And those photos just were flat. They don't look right. They're like too clinical while also lacking detail all at the same time. And they just didn't look good. And this camera reminds me of that. Every few shots, I'll take some shots that are amazing, that blow my mind, that are really incredible, they're really cool. But then it'll pop out a shot that reminds me, oh yeah, the early 2000s looked like dog crap, largely. And so I'm all for the youth, you know, turning my childhood into a trend. That's fine. It's fine, even though it, to me, makes no sense. I think it's cool that people are readopting and reusing these cameras that are just sitting in antique stores doing nothing. Like, I think it's cool that people are making cool stuff out of these. But let's not forget, the early 2000s didn't look good. And these cameras largely don't look good either. Most of them don't. This is an exception, which is why ever since I got this, I've noticed a lot of people carry around these little Canons around, because I think these probably are the best looking. These have the most personality of point and shoots in the modern day. This is probably the best amongst the early 2000 DIGICAMS. So I'll carry this around. I'll still use it. It's fun. Every once in a while I'll get something really cool out of it. Really, at the end of the day, film photography coming back makes a ton of sense. And I think that's because we've learned something over the past couple decades, which is that film looks better than digital. It just does. Our digital photos are now edited so that they look as close to film as humanly possible, because we've learned that film photography ages well. The look, the grain, the colors, the maybe lack of detail just ages better over time, and I think is more pleasing to the eye. The problem with film, though, the reason we had to move into digital is because the process was untenable. The process is a pain in the butt. I mean, I know that people like film because of the process, but at the same time, photography needed to get easier to move through the culture and to be more economically viable to people. And so digital photography solved the process problem. However, it kind of, for a while, put us in a dark ages of like really terrible looking visual material. I mean, digital photography, we really had to go through some years of some rough looking stuff for a long time, and it was tough out there. So yeah, DIGICAMS, they're cool, and I'm all for people taking a photography tool and doing the most creative thing they can with it. But DIGICAMS are kind of bad, and they can be good. But let's not forget that, you know, they're mostly bad.